to kind of summarize, we have this sense among some historians that we can have scientific levels of objectivity, and any kind of knowledge is being questioned on the other side by people like Friedrich Nietzsche, who argue we can't know really much of anything objectively. However, we're still doing history, right? You still have historians, still have people who believe that history is still important. And so we have this question, what pushed us back towards that idea of at least practical objectivity? Right? Beard, for example, even though he had been challenged in his term and no longer believed in scientific objectivity, he still did history because he thought something good could come out of it. Even if we can't know it 100% true, 100% certainty, we can at least know it well enough to bring some positive good. Now, why does Beard and people like Bloch, why do they win out against Nietzsche and those who question the possibility of doing anything? It's because in the 1930s and 40s, we're exposed to ideologies that ignore historic truth. So, for example, the Nazi regime, pictured here, is burning books. And the Nazis attempted to rewrite history in a way to romanticize the nation. And of course, they also tried to rewrite history to make it so minorities such as Jewish people, far from helping the nation, being an integral part of the nation, were harmful to the nation. And when you're exposed to these kind of, and I want to stress, the Nazis engaged in outright fabrications of history. So, for example, to prove how advanced the ancient Germans, who they claimed to be descended from, they would actually manufacture like pieces of pottery and arrowheads and things like that and discover them and say, look, we just discovered this thing, which we actually made. Doesn't it prove how awesome German people were in the past and how awesome we are today? And these were blatant fabrications, and people knew it at the time, who were serious historians and archaeologists, of course, too. And when you're confronted with that and the terrible regime that it supported, you kind of say, yeah, maybe I can't know 100% objectively true about the past, but I know that this is bunk. I know this is all false, and that you're building a terrible government upon it. So practically speaking, I can know history well enough. And especially after the war, or even during the latter part of the war, when the full meaning of the Holocaust is understood, there's a sense that there's something really wrong here. You can kind of sit back when life is okay, or maybe it's just a little confusing, and say, you know what, I don't know if there's really a right or wrong. But when you're confronted with something as evil as the Holocaust, it's hard to say there's no real right and wrong, I think. Something about it just seems really, really bad. And that means that there is meaning. Moreover, there's a sense that certain historical circumstances helped lead to the Holocaust. Certain economic forces, certain political forces, certain choices that people made, those things all helped lead to the Holocaust. And if we can understand the causes that led to the Holocaust, we can prevent it from happening again. Well, that's history. That's, again, remember, that's what historians study. How things have changed and what caused those changes. What causes historical events? Why did a Holocaust happen? How could it have been prevented? How can we make sure it never happens again? So it's curious. World War I, in many ways, the suffering led people to question truth and meaning and morality. The greater suffering, in a sense, I think you can argue that the Holocaust is a greater kind of suffering than what was experienced in World War I, as well as just all the other people who die in the war. That causes people to say, you know what? Maybe there is something to history, because history can tell us why these terrible things happened and can help us take steps that will never happen again. Further supporting that view is the fact that we have another ideology. Communism is practiced by the Soviet Union that also sought, like the Nazis, to ignore historic truth, to purposely falsify history for political gain, that was often just for a desire for power rather than a desire to do anything good. So to give you an example, there's Joseph Stalin right there. And with the help of this man, a high Soviet official, he launched massive purges that killed tens of thousands of people, many of whom were completely innocent. Then later on, this guy became a political liability, and Stalin had him executed. Right? This was Stalin's executioner. And eventually Stalin had him executed too. And so he became a political liability. Right? Here he was considered a good guy, so he could be in this picture with Stalin. He becomes a political liability. You erase him. He's gone. So we've just gone through this experience, humanity has, right, of this horrible evil, the Holocaust, happening. How did that happen? Why did it happen? And a lot of it had to do with false and perverted ideas about history that argued that minorities like Jewish people were a threat to the nation rather than people who helped make the nation better. And while the Nazis had been defeated, we have another regime, the Soviet Union, who was doing terrible things and was trying to justify itself through history, either, again, like perverting history or just making it up. And I think it's very, you get then people who say things like this. You may have heard of George Orwell, famous author of Animal Farm in 1984. And in 1984, he wrote, and this is a novel, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." Right? So basically the idea is in these totalitarian regimes, you have people who want to seize power, be it the Nazis or the Soviet Union. And when they seize power, they try and gain control over the production of knowledge. And they try and make sure that that knowledge production is not done in the name of truth, is not done following correct historical methodology that tries to critically examine sources and goes where the sources lead, but rather goes where the political needs say it should go. And that then gives those people who control the past, that gives them control of the future. So in one sense, historians were inspired that we could learn about the past in ways that would help prevent things like the Holocaust. At the same time, there's a fear that there are people who want to pervert and destroy historical truth for their own political need. As you can guess, this helped give historians a sense of hope and mission in the 40s and 50s. In addition, there was infrastructure behind this. Right? There was a lot of confidence and hope among historians, both because we thought, hey, we can do something to make this a better place, to help prevent terrible tragedies brought by human choice, such as the Holocaust, and that we need to be able to do this because we have another threat, the Soviet Union. But like I said, there's an infrastructure beneath this because you also have the GI Bill, which means that a lot of Americans are going to get a college education based on their military service than there had been in the past. So all of a sudden there's going to be a lot more students, many of whom will study history, which means, hey, you need a lot more history professors. So you've got an increasingly confident, hopeful, and expanding group of historians. And this leads to, in the 1940s and into the 50s, what we call the consensus school of history. Now, this is from another book, Historiography, Ancient, Medieval, and Modern, which is amazing. I highly recommend it. But this talks about the kind of consensus historians came in the 1950s. Underlying this view was the conviction that beneath all the conflicts and competing forces in American society, there's persisted a fundamental unity of experiences, ideals, and purposes. Did not all those who argued with each other in the past and the present over the proper American way of life believe in democracy, progress, and even some form of capitalism? So basically there's this argument, yes, there's conflict among historians and in American society, but notice how this conflict is contained within certain parameters. None of us are saying that democracy is bad. None of us is saying that progress is bad. And all of us believe in some form of capitalism. Hence, the so-called consensus school can be better understood as a shifting of emphasis. Tradition, seen as a common core of ideas and experiences and supportive of the concept of the nation as a whole, now ranked as a shaping force above and ahead of the vision of an ideal democracy, which was prepared by necessary and continuous conflicts between competing interests and groups. So there's this idea there might be conflict within our society. There might be different interests. There might be different groups. But you know what? There are still certain core beliefs that hold us Americans together. And this leads to a kind of consensus in the 50s. Now, as you know, though, in the 60s, there's a lot of conflict in the United States. And I think we can get a kind of clue to that when we look back at President Roosevelt signing the GI Bill. Here, right? Here's President Roosevelt. I believe this might be Eleanor Roosevelt. But look at all these important government officials. And the president himself. They're all white men. Can you imagine seeing a picture similar to this today? The United States, of course, is more diverse now than it was in the 1940s. But in the 1940s, it was still pretty diverse. And so when you see an image like this, on one side, you can understand how there would be a feeling of consensus. I'm sure that if these men were to talk to each other, they would agree with this consensus. But if you were, say, African American and are being left out of the prosperity, my understanding is that the GI Bill, for example, did not give African Americans the same opportunities it gave white Americans. If you're being excluded from this prosperity, you don't feel maybe like there's so much of a consensus. So while we may have some consensus in the 1950s, in part because these are the guys who are doing the talking, in the 1960s, there's going to be more and more voices saying, you know what? We don't know if we agree with this consensus. We think there's a problem here. And I want to stress, these voices aren't just national, they're international. Right? In 1968, the same year that you had the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, the murder of Robert Kennedy, you also had massive protests in France. So this isn't something that's just in the United States. And naturally, this will impact historians. And there's a sense here that history has been guided by people who look like this. And the argument increasingly in the 60s is we need more people to add their voices to how we understand history. And a lot of the rest of this course is going to be on what I call decentering historiography, where we move to think about other ways of understanding history from different perspectives. So we'll stop there, but I look forward to talking to you more about this decentering of historiography.